So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Weisberg, the Deputy Director of Prairie World House. Welcome to our last event of the calendar year. I'm so glad to see so many of you brave the rain, and we were thinking we might have to offer kayaks, but you made it anyway. This is a really exciting event we're doing. It came together in literally just a few days, but our wonderful partners at the Climate Center for Energy Policy and EII, the Environmental Innovations Initiative, and Prairie World House got this together with the help of the White House. So it's really terrific to see all of you. So as we wrap up this year, it's just a few weeks past COP29 in Azerbaijan, where, as I think many of you know, the big decisions were taken, especially on climate finance, but also on something else that many of us have an interest in, adaptation, and maybe we'll get there today. It's really great to have a chance to reflect on the year with Ali Zaidi, who's an assistant to the president and the National Climate Advisor. It's really terrific to have you, welcome you here today, Ali. So in his role, Ali leads the White House Climate Policy Office, which coordinates policy development and President Biden's all-of-government approach to tackle the climate crisis that involves building climate into good-paying union jobs and advancing environmental justice. So Mr. Zaidi is a longtime advisor to the president, providing counsel and leadership on climate policy, development, legislation, and executive action, and he was there from the first day of the administration. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, which he helped design and negotiate, is one example of this, and I'm sure we'll be hearing about that today. Before his present role, Mr. Zaidi served as Deputy National Climate Advisor, and he joined the Biden-Harris administration after serving as the State of New York's Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment and Chairman of Climate Policy and Finance, where he led the state's efforts on climate change. Mr. Zaidi also served as an adjunct professor at my alma mater, Stanford University, where he co-founded Lawyers for a Sustainable Economy, a Stanford coordinated initiative that equips sustainability-focused startups with pro bono legal advice. Mr. Zaidi immigrated to the United States from Pakistan, and perhaps most relevant to us, he is a native Pennsylvania, grew up outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, but we may have to talk about sports teams, at the end, because I suspect you have different views. And he went from there to Harvard University and a JD, he earned his JD from Georgetown University. And we're also really excited to have on stage today Justin Werland, who's a senior correspondent at the time in the Washington, D.C. Bureau. He received Covering Climate Now's inaugural Climate Journalist of the Year Award in 2022, and he is the Outrider Foundation Fellow at Time. So really, really pleased to welcome both of you today. The way we're going to do things is we're going to have Ali speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a moderated conversation. Then there'll be lots of time for your questions, both from the audience and from our online audience. So again, everybody, welcome to Prairie World House, especially welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just really grateful to be here at the University of Pennsylvania, an anchor institution in this Commonwealth, a Commonwealth, as Michael noted, that with arms outstretched welcomed my family decades ago. Our amazing parents raised us on the other side of the state, however. Some of you may know that as Steelers country. But all of Pennsylvania feels like home, especially in an auditorium where I can literally see my brother in scrubs in the back, a cardiologist here at Penn. Pennsylvania bears the fingerprints of the opportunity embedded in climate change all across the state. I've had over the last 4 years an opportunity to travel to various points of light here in the state. In Philadelphia, met with laborers, pipe fitters, steam fitters who are replacing leaking methane pipes, making communities safer, reducing the cost of energy for families, and taking a super pollutant out of the sky. I've been here outside of the city and in central PA, meeting with folks on the frontier of climate smart agriculture, growing commodities, and getting a premium for the climate benefit that they're putting into the marketplace. I've been to my hometown in Erie, PA, where they're manufacturing electric locomotives at a factory that has gone in and out of competitiveness, but now is at the frontier of a pull globally for cleaner transportation. And One of the more inspiring stories that sort of sticks with me all the time is the mine workers in Southwest PA that I had a chance to meet with a couple of months ago, who have carried us on their backs 100 years. They've kept the lights on. They're now helping produce the active material that goes into cathodes, that goes into batteries, and going to make sure that we keep the lights on for the next 100 years. At this moment of political transition, Michael noted the Baku conference. There's other things that happened in November. I'm really keen to join you and join in this discussion and draw attention to a facet of the immutable reality imposed by the greenhouse gas emissions trapped in our atmosphere, the resultant warming of the Earth. And in particular, with your indulgence, I want to argue that in this decade, in the reality in which we live and will continue to live, there is a bright through line that runs across all essential strategies that we have available to us to secure U.S. global competitiveness and domestic prosperity. And I know that's a bold statement, but hang with me and you'll get to decide whether that's one that is compelling to you. These interconnected tasks of securing U.S. global competitiveness and domestic prosperity require us, I think, not only to observe the risks of climate change, which cascade through nature, through our built environment, into our economy, and into our very beings, our psychology and our psyche, our peace of mind. These tasks require us not only to observe the risks of climate change, but also the embedded opportunity. Under President Biden, over the last 4 years, with leaders from parties of both stripes, governors, mayors, tribal leaders all across the country, we have built a domestic and international economic approach that sees this through line. And I'm hopeful about the bipartisan and intergovernmental resilience and durability of the direction we are on, the prospects of not losing the thread. Over the last 4 years, we've come together and proven that climate action is the new foundry for economic opportunity and growth in the United States, the figurative factory floor where we are forging a stronger American middle class and mounting the comeback of American manufacturing. The support for this approach, which I think is strong and growing, notwithstanding what you might read on push alerts, derives from delivering a visible difference close to home. Places once idled are now turning back on. 600 factories and counting all across America. People once left out are now being pulled in and given purpose. 330,000 new clean energy jobs being created in the United States, and union density at twice the levels of the rest of the economy. And policy that once felt pie in the sky is now steel in the ground, as $1 trillion, literally $1 trillion of private capital has moved off the sidelines and onto the field. The support is for and the momentum is behind a particular type of climate action. Climate action that's pursued in a way that co-locates with economic opportunity and coincides with pollution reduction. A geographic and temporal alignment of benefits designed to earn the political economy to go big, to go fast, and to go the distance. This is important because we're talking about a long-term, decades in the making global challenge. And the way we found the political economy to solve it is actually by pulling forward the benefits and pulling them close, by focusing on what's most proximate to the people. That is how the foundry runs, delivering locally, strengthening domestic prosperity. But the implications of this very productive playbook reach far beyond our borders. The US approach to climate action is now, I think this is indisputable, a pillar of our global competitiveness. And our progress has also propelled additional global action a race to the top that the benefits of which we are all enjoying. How policymakers today answer a few big questions will determine the strength of this pillar. And it's not just policymakers, it's academia, it's private capital, it's all of us who are involved in the big decisions that our country faces. The first is, how clear-eyed are we about responding to the physical impacts of climate change? There is this, I think, really problematic conventional wisdom that there are places that are safe from the risks imposed by climate change. But we saw that reality pierced in North Carolina as a place that was supposed to be impervious to climate change, not only saw itself inundated, but saw a profound degradation of its infrastructure. One way we will be tested on whether we are properly responding to the physical aspects of climate change is how attentive we are to the grid, to our transportation system, to our critical infrastructure that enables our competitiveness. Climate risk is embedded in that question. And again, on the notion of bipartisan support, this is a place where Senator Murkowski from Alaska, on the frontier of helping write into the bipartisan infrastructure law a grid program that we've been able to implement that helps bury the lines and strengthen the interconnection, make sure that the substations don't flood when the next storm comes through. Another place where we will answer this question is in our agricultural sector. We see the impacts of climate so profoundly on the agricultural sector. We also see now increasingly the value the agricultural sector can deliver in breathing in the carbon. Turns out those two things kind of run in tandem. If we invest in our farmers and our ranchers, in building a set of carbon markets that compensate, commodity markets that deliver the value back to the growers themselves, we can help not only build climate solutions, but increase the total factor productivity of the agriculture sector. It's seeing the climate through line, leaning into it, and boosting the competitiveness of our sector. The second big question is, in the technologies where US manufacturing is nascent, will we go the distance to build it out? This is a really important question because in a lot of cases, we've been really good at inventing the thing in the laboratory, but struggling to take it to the factory floor. And if you want to determine which countries will race ahead in the technology race of the future, you don't just look at the length of the laboratory bench, you look at the square feet of factory floor. So one place where we know that that race is happening is in the nuclear sector. And in Baku, the United States released a strategy for how we will triple our nuclear capacity. And at the heart of that is a race to build out our manufacturing capability over the next decade so that we can deploy 15 gigawatts of nuclear a year. Manufacturing is the necessary bridge between invention and impact. It's absolutely necessary. And no country, I think, can lead on innovation without the industrial capacity to turn the plans into products. That's why I think this manufacturing renaissance that we're seeing across the country that's turning on all of these factories that had gone idle has so many bottom lines. But one of them is that it helps American scientists and engineers now shine a brighter light into the future. We've got to make sure we keep answering that question in a way that is affirmative and strengthening of this competitiveness opportunity we have in front of us. The third is a variant of the question, but an important one. And that is, how committed are we to deepening the supply chain that we're building? So it's build the first one and maybe fit for purpose for the deployment in the country. But then there's how much are we investing in really building it out? I talked about the mine workers who are helping with the cathode active material. But there's the machinists and the welders who are involved in the membrane technology. How are we investing to make sure all of that is brought home? And here's why I think that's important. My brother in particular will laugh at this analogy because he'll say, I have no idea what I'm talking about. But a point guard with a low center of gravity, bear with me, can more quickly pivot to the open lane. If we've got that strength in our deepened clean energy supply chain, I think we'll be able to chase down the technologies that win out. So, for example, in batteries, the Nobel Prize for lithium ion went to a scientist in the United States. It was perfected at Argonne National Lab, and then we lost our advantage. Now we're working really hard to catch up. On LFP, we've fallen behind dramatically, and we've got companies racing to try to catch up. But when we look at new technologies like solid state, and that doesn't mean one thing, it means many things, our ability to chase down the open lane will depend on the depth of our supply chain. Our ability to catch the next wave of solar perovskites will depend on our ability to have a broad, multi-purpose supply chain that can run where the technology is going. The third big question that we all have to answer is whether we can put the efficiencies in the system to actually deploy this stuff. Congress, as we speak, is debating whether to continue to expand the red tape reduction in our permitting regime. But permitting is not the only place where we have efficiency opportunities. It's cutting the waste on our grid by reconductoring our power lines, allowing them to carry 2, 3, maybe 4 times more power. It's helping build out the workforce that's capable of constructing some of this stuff. We built our first big new nuclear reactor in Vogel, Georgia. 100 million craft hours of skilled labor went into that. Enough power now to support 1 million homes of clean energy. But when I talked to the workers, they said, if there's not another new project on the horizon, these folks are going to retrain to do something else. That takes away from our nimbleness. So our ability to efficiently race behind this transformation, to unlock the full economic benefit and to be competitive, depends on permitting. It depends on workforce. It depends on building the enabling infrastructure, the soft infrastructure that helps us actually deploy. And the final thing I'll raise is the big question of whether the US will help build out the global platforms that allow our companies to keep taking the risks that unleash innovation and economic opportunity. We have in the United States, for example, in the industrial sector, a built-in advantage. Our steel is twice as clean as the steel produced in China. But in the global conversation about climate and trade, which is trying to not just level the playing field, but level it up by being able to see where the carbon molecules flow embedded in products across borders, the US has had to catch up and risks falling behind. There's bipartisan conversation on this. Senator Cassidy, Senator Coons, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Kramer, others saying we need to turn our attention to it. But the European carbon border adjustment kicks in January 2026. Will we have our answer on that platform? Will we be at the table as the US chases after reductions of pollution from superpollutants like N2O? In a yesteryear, we were able to forge on a bipartisan basis a consensus to bend the curve on hydrofluorocarbons. That translated into an international coming together in Kigali. And then a few months after the Inflation Reduction Act, it translated into the first environmental treaty ratified in the United States Senate on a bipartisan basis. Why? Because it was good for domestic prosperity. It was good for global competitiveness. will we have the appetite to work on a multilateral basis to build the platforms necessary to facilitate capital formation, to unleash American innovation, to go after the prize in these areas, whether it's in the industrial sector, chemical substitutes for high GWP pollutants? We need to be at the table. And one version of that conversation where I think we risk falling behind is in the critical task, and this may sound counterintuitive relative to everything else I've laid out, of helping other countries also build out not only their ability to deploy, but their ability to manufacture. The United States Development Finance Corporation, one of the deals I love that we've gotten done over the last 4 years, took a technology from Ohio, First Solar, and helped them build out a manufacturing facility in Tamil Nadu in India. That helps us all collectively race to address the root cause and take this political economy approach of delivering local benefits and making it global, making this entire transition more robust and more resilient. Look, today, just this morning, we announced a new set of investments into the replacement of diesel trucks and heavy-duty vehicles around the country. Hundreds of diesel trucks that will go offline and be replaced by trucks that don't pump pollution into the sky. And it's another reminder of the incredible salience of a climate approach that literally helps communities breathe easier. Whether it's that work or the work we're doing on water to make sure you can turn the faucet with greater peace of mind, or the jobs I talked about being created all across America and also in places just east of here and west of here. In York, for example, Voith Hydro, the machinists manufacturing the next generation of that technology. That's helping us deliver that domestic prosperity. But let's not forget how that links to a global conversation and be affirmative about seeing that through line. If we try to turn that off, if we drop the thread, I think we miss out on a massive opportunity on behalf of the American people. I have incredible hopefulness about the bipartisan nature of this, the intergovernmental durability of it, the combination of the public and private sector pulling in the right direction. But the Academy, all of you, all of us are on the hook to go the distance and finish the job. We have unleashed a truly powerful playbook, a new foundry for economic growth and opportunity. The implications aren't just domestic, they reach abroad. They aren't just about our prosperity, but they're about our competitiveness and propelling the world to move in the right direction, not just in seeing the risks, but in seizing the opportunity. So grateful to be here with you and to be in conversation with the one and only Justin Werland. Right.
Well, thank you, Ali, and good to be in conversation with you. I think you did a great job making the case for the durability. You set up a lot of the key questions, so much so that I should have just written them down and then asked them back to you, like, what are the answers to your questions? I want to start with the durability point and maybe just get a little specific here. I think the administration has made the case that that this is durable, that it's much like maybe the Affordable Care Act, where Republicans might try to get rid of it, but it's just very hard to do. And I think we're already seeing this, where Republicans are pushing back at attempts to do that in Congress. But at the same time, Republicans did chip away at the ACA, right? They did get rid of certain provisions, and they were persistent at that. And so I guess my first question is, where are you most worried about provisions, elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then in the spirit of encouraging people here, what could be done about that? What's the best way to protect against some of those potential challenges?
So number one, I think the politics of climate inaction are deteriorating, and the politics around what was a party line bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, passed with no Republican votes, has broadened to include Republican support. And because we're in a university, let me provide some data to support my assertion. The first is you've got in the House of Representatives, 18, but maybe now 14 Republicans who wrote to the speaker saying, this does not work for our economic program and our politics. Let's not go running around trying to unplug these jobs. That takes a lot of courage to break with your party and with your leadership and signal support for a program signed into law by the president of another party. But that's doesn't stand on its own. You've got now Republican governors all across the country. Oklahoma Governor Stitt, whose entire economic track record really hangs on capital formation that took place because of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's really hard to go to Stitt, to Kemp, to Holcomb, to others and say, hey, we're going to destabilize your state economy in the interest of some ideological win. So I think that's thing number one. Is I think we have data points for the IRA in particular, which was a partisan bill, turning into a more of a bipartisan. The second is the sort of mechanical durability. So there's the IRA had sort of two big pillars to it. The tax pillar is about, at the time, scored at $269 billion, and then or thereof. And then about 110 billion of tax credit, of not tax credits, of grants that went to states, to local governments, to companies. Of that 110, 100 is out. So there's a complexity, a mechanical durability associated with that, where you have the ranking member, soon to be chair of the Environment Committee in the Senate, Shelley Moore Capito, saying $27 billion, one of the biggest components of that set of grant monies, which goes to capitalize green banks around the country. We can't claw that back. That's already in the hands of the recipients. We're not a banana republic. We don't go try to claw back the cash we've already handed to somebody under contract. So that's the mechanical durability of it. I think there's this other piece of it, and maybe this concedes a little bit to the conventional wisdom that this is vulnerable. Speaker Johnson and others have said, maybe we'll take I'm paraphrasing, but using the words, maybe we will take a scalpel, but not a sledgehammer to the Biden climate agenda. And I think otherwise it's a very coherent approach, and, kind of ended up defaulting to that on the Affordable Care Act. Why that's really hard in this case is there's a lot of interconnectivity between these various incentives. So the incoming administration has shown that they're not particularly enthusiastic about offshore wind. Been pretty unambiguous about that. But they love shipbuilding. And shipbuilding in the United States is primarily being spurred by the offshore wind industry. In fact, a massive ship that was just inaugurated had at its christening Representative Scalise, who's going to be in the leadership of the incoming House of Representatives. So how do you cut with a scalpel and then not lose the thing that you want? Take another example, batteries. There's been a lot of animus around the EV tax credit that goes to the retail, to the consumer, the $7,500 if you buy a new EV, or the $4,000 you get for a used EV. And folks who articulate that say, well, I'm fine supporting battery manufacturing. I'm fine supporting the manufacturing of those cathode active materials that I referenced earlier. I love mining in the United States, whether it's for lithium or it's for nickel at Talon in Minnesota. But I'm not into, giving people a tax credit. Okay, two big problems with that. If you repeal the tax credit, what does that do to the domestic demand, and how does that destabilize all of this investment that's built to feed that demand. That's thing number one. Can't sleep on that risk. But the second is that tax credit has as its feature a rule called the foreign entities of concern, which actually is the only reason why we are domesticating and onshoring all of this supply chain, because to get that credit, to get that incentive, we basically said you have to bring all this stuff back home. You blow up that rule by blowing up that tax credit, and you've now given a green light to source all of your material from China and other countries that are home to these foreign entities of concern. So I think there's all of these things make it quite complex. And so I then bet on the momentum that American industry and American workers have at their back right now.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear people who are working on congressional education, talk about what it's like to explain to a member of Congress who then starts seeing these connections that they didn't realize, and then all of a sudden they're awoken and then have to think differently. I guess I'm curious on the point of on the political economy question. Workers supporting these measures. You mentioned the people capping methane leaks. I mean, do they have a sticker that says, this was supported by the Inflation Reduction Act? I mean, President Biden yesterday said he learned one thing from Trump, which is sign the check. I'm paraphrasing. Sign the check, like the checks to Americans. I mean, is that something that I guess let me say it this way. Did you sign the check, and do you wish you had if you didn't?
So there is a challenge with behavioral psychology that's worked against us in selling the success of the Inflation Reduction Act that actually works with us in defending the clawback. Same thing happened with the Affordable Care Act. So when you're selling people something new, it's something new. Most people in America want a little bit more, but primarily don't destabilize my situation. And novelty change is highly risky. So when we're going out trying to sell people, say, hey, if you sign up for this program, support, the Inflation Reduction Act, then maybe these jobs will get created. That's a tough proposition. And there's a whole bunch of behavioral psychology that will tell you why that is the case. The flip side is now you've got someone in Dalton, Georgia, who got laid off during the real estate bust when all those carpet factories went away, that's now trained up to work at a solar factory. And you're going to go to them and you're going to say, you're going to be fired because somebody doesn't like the 45X tax credit or the domestic content bonus in the tech neutral. That's a much more, I think, provocative and empathetic response that you will get as a result. So I feel good about the companies understand what makes their economics tick, and the workers as a result will know what is at stake when this debate's taking place, as opposed to a kind of like the Field of Dreams conversation that we were having 2-3 years ago, trying to get people enthusiastic about something that hadn't shown up yet.
One of the sort of interesting changes there, think about when the IRA passed, and there was sort of mixed messages from industries, some of whom really supported the tax incentives, but were really concerned about the tax provisions. And I guess thinking now, critical to keeping some of these measures in place is support from industry. There's also an active tax conversation, and that will be next year. I guess what is the sense that you're getting from industry about their willingness to really lean in and support these measures, perhaps even to the detriment of other things they care about? And I guess what's your message to them?
For the, people say, okay, well, the IRA passed about 2 years ago. Not all the factories are obviously built. Not everything's operating. Not all of it's sort of fully metabolized into the system. What has largely happened is companies have gotten to FID, to final investment decision. And that means capital is now counting on this outcome. So it's actually quite an easy conversation with a company to say, what happens if now you take a machete to your cash flow model? They know they inherently know that. I think what you'll see is some of the old fights that business groups have wanted to have on the Hill, including around corporate tax rates, as well as some of the loophole closing that the administration tried to do as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think those things will get reopened. And my guess is they'll have a easier time pushing for change there. There's obviously the 2017 tax cuts that some of which need more run room. They'll be pushing for that. If you go to an industry and say, you know, which of these do you have to choose between? I don't know the answer to that. I'm skeptical that that's necessarily the question that will be framed up. And it really goes to this broader question of how the next Congress and the next administration approach fiscal space, and how much they prioritize sort of stock market economy versus sort of a long-term, call it ivory tower economic view. And if you look at how the stock market is likely to respond to not destabilizing the IRA and maybe doing some incremental stuff on the corporate side, I think there's going to be a lot of reward there. So the question is, will those folks win out, or will the ivory tower folks win out in defining the fiscal space question? And that'll color whether, but I'm skeptical that that's the question people are actually going to get presented.
Yeah, I mean, never so simple as a trade-off like that, but you know, as part of that mix. I guess I'm curious, when you think about you know, the next administration and the work that you've done, and you framed up some of these key questions here, things like trade, permitting, like, are there areas where you see opportunity for continuity, if not even progress in some ways, or is that too hopeful?
I think there's been a recognition from the incoming administration around some of the unavoidable questions of consequence to our global competitiveness. One of them is around the need to build the clean electricity, or the electricity to supply the AI training models and the data centers that need to get built out in the United States, something like 35 gigawatts of energy. I think if you stick to that as your goal, that I have to supply the 35 gigs, you'll have a really hard time sidelining nuclear, hydro, solar with storage, any electrons that are willing and ready to show up on that time frame. And so that, to me, is an optimistic thing of, I think the government will recognize the interest from a competitiveness perspective and security perspective of building out that AI data infrastructure. And clean electrons will be, in many ways, the best bet to supply. I think in trade, there's been an interesting, this is maybe counter-conventional wisdom, but interesting passing of the baton between our administration from the Trump administration and perhaps now to the Trump administration. Solar is in an interesting place. The Trump administration put some solar tariffs on. That created a moat, but there wasn't an engine in the United States to really fill on the inside. We've now built an engine in the United States, and so the reinforcement of a trade policy that actually allows that engine to achieve escape velocity, that's probably a good thing if it's done smartly. How that broader trade architecture shapes up, I think, will be of great consequence. But having appropriate weighting of the trade regime in a way that helps continue to balance or level the playing field in places like electrolyzers, for example, where there's a lot of competition, I think that's good. So I think there will be some continuity there. Now, whether the rhetoric matches the reality and it's just far more pervasive and et cetera. That obviously is not just counterproductive, that's destructive.
There's a lot of threads we could pull there, but I want to turn to the audience for some questions. And I believe there's a mic for anybody with a question. So, okay, let's start here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you for your wonderful remarks. I was wondering if you could comment on the Chips and Science Act, given that we are at a university and there is some research funding opportunities for basic research in that act, and how do you see that durability and stability? And also, a second question, if I may, is related to minerals that are needed for the energy transition that are basically at a global scale, like overseas, and they are mostly, those countries are mostly trading with PCR. And yeah, so we're seeing where is the edge, like the competitive edge of the States versus other potential like global countries in those fields? And thank you. That's it.
Yeah, that's great. On there's been a truism on Capitol Hill that basic science and R&D is a place where there's a lot of bipartisan consensus. I think that's generally true. What I found is that in the last decade and a half, there's a lot of authorization. There's a lot of like hortatory stuff in this space, but when it comes down to cash, it's not been flowing as robustly. Even if you look at the architecture of the Chips and Science Act, a lot of the stuff in there is not funded. The work for fusion at universities, big numbers, not a lot of cash. The clusters, a lot of initial architecture funding, but not the cash to go the distance. And so I think there's a big question in my mind of, as you go, especially into the debate after this tax debate, there will be a lot of the infrastructure law expires in 2026. At that moment, will we be able to find the cash and prioritize it on a bipartisan basis to meet the test? So I think there's some runway here. I don't think there's a cliff. And I think there's a deeply learned sense of urgency on chips themselves, because all of those factories that shut down in the summer of 2021. But I don't take it as granted that we're actually going to be on an appropriately upward trajectory on basic science. And I'm actually quite alarmed about that. I think identifying the climate through line there is helpful, because it also sort of ties it to some other politics globally that maybe create more of a case for it. The second question, the second question is minerals. Yes. On the minerals, it's not so much that PRC owns the minerals, it's that they've been the only ones that have really expanded the refining and upgrading capability. And we've really started to reverse that trend, not just in the US, but with allies and partners. So as that continues to take place, I'm feeling pretty good about the shift over time. The problem with that is the reason the PRC was able to do it, and this goes so core to like the reflection and critique of policy over the last decade, you totally miss what happened over the last 4 years if you think America just got in the production business. We created a strong domestic demand for these technologies, and that paired with production tax credits is what allowed for the capital formation and the project development. So if you take out, for example, the EPA tailpipe standards, you don't see the kind of electric vehicle shift that we've seen in the United States, and you probably don't see the Salton Sea getting the kind of investment it has on lithium. You probably don't see the Talon investment in nickel in Minnesota. You probably don't see the investment in synthetic graphite in Arkansas. those things are happening because we also created strong domestic demand. So I think they're embedded in what you said. There are sort of two questions. Is it impossible to catch up? Hell no. Is this a very fragile inflection point, and could it break a bunch of different ways? Absolutely. So that's why we got to keep the whole thing together. I talked about the scalpel analogy. Think about a Jenga tower. You're pulling blocks out. You don't know what's critical to the structural integrity of that tower. And that's the problem with these policies is people think, oh, you could just pull the EPA thing out. Okay, what did you do to domestic demand? What does that do all the way upstream?
Thanks. Sorry, I'll take a privilege of asking this question. I'm curious about the global politics, which you only barely touched on mentioning CBAM. So if you started listening in Dubai and then in Bonn and then in the G20 and then in Baku, the loudest thing that was kind of anti-US and not just from the PRC was just absolutely being enraged about the IRA. And I just wondered, I mean, this is more looking back than looking forward. Can you tell us about how you guys conceptualize the global politics of the IRA? Because lots of countries that are otherwise, you know, kind of generally happy to go along with US things in these processes were just, they're not actually that upset about CBAM, but they're really upset about the IRA. So I'm curious how you thought about those politics.
Yeah, so great question. The first is the Inflation Reduction Act. The first I will do in defense of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then I will get more to the core of your question. The in defense of the Inflation Reduction Act. If you look at the IRA and the technology innovation it will drive, for every ton of emissions we reduce here in the United States, in the decade that follows, we'll probably reduce 2 to 3 tons around the world. So we are helping buy down in a global public good way the cost of innovation associated with technologies that will help support sustainable development. That's thing number one. Thing number two is the IRA was born out of essentially a way out of recession in the United States and an antidote to our own inflationary problems, especially around energy, how to bend that curve. So it was designed in large part to be responsive to our domestic challenges. And in that way, it has been not only helpful for us, and we've had the strongest economic recovery of all of the leading economies, it's also been replicated in places like Japan and elsewhere. So it's served as a template for others building recovery programs that were green and not gray in their bias. It is incomplete. And the conversation around US global competitiveness is incomplete if we only support the ability of the US to build out the supply chains in this space. I mentioned this in my remarks, but to sort of elaborate on it, the architecture of the Baku decision, the 300, and then the mobilization on top of it, even in that money sort of at the core, at the sort of the public side, is a real expectation the World Bank and the MDBs will stretch in ways they have not to date. And what that almost has to look like over the next decade is expansion more aggressively into building out manufacturing capability around the world. So if done right, and there's a period between now and when parties gather back together in Brazil for the next COP, if done right, I think global institutions will come together to fashion essentially the IRA for the world. There's a big problem in the United States Congress and in our political discourse where we went from the country under George W. Bush that understood its self-interest in PEPFAR and Gavi and in spending the resources necessary in the global South to ensure global stability, security, and peace, to a country that really cuts corners on that stuff. Development aid is completely incapable of matching the level of need and demand around the world. So, you know, as I think about the task over the next 2 years, 4 and 6 increments with elections, one of the essential ones is to help people understand better the competitiveness implications for the US, the prosperity implications for the US of trying to ramp up our contribution to the build out of this clean energy economy around the world. So to answer one is the IRA was not trying to solve for this, but answer two is if it had been, the politics were not there, and we're going to need to create them.
It's great. Okay, so let's just take both of these questions at once and see if we can cram more in.
Hey, thanks for being here. Wanted to hear, you talked a little bit about investment in the private sector from the private sector. How do you think that private equity and venture capital are getting it right in this space, and how are they maybe missing the mark?
So thank you. My question will be regarding nuclear reactors because you mentioned them several times in your speech. And I would like to ask that, isn't there like a national security threat in making the US energy supply more dependable on nuclear reactors when only 5% of uranium is produced in the US? And a large part of it, I think more than a third of it, is produced in Central Asian countries, which are under Russian influence and be cut off by China or Russia. Thank you.
So I'll use the first one to actually jump into second. You're right. And that's why we signed a ban on Russian uranium, and we made a multi-billion-dollar investment in restarting our enrichment capabilities, including of highly enriched uranium necessary for the next generation of reactors. So we got to do that. I don't think that is an unmitigatable risk. I think it's a massive opportunity for us to bring even more jobs and opportunity into the United States. That's my answer to thing number two, which is I think there's been an underinvestment broadly in the enabling supply chains for the energy transition. There's been some capital formation that's been assisted by the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure law. But take, for example, transformers and HVDC cabling. You cannot have an expanding grid without transformers and HVDC cabling. And if you don't have an expanding grid, you don't have a clean energy transition, basically in any sector of the economy. The queue time for transformers has just been jumping year over year over year. That's a massive investment opportunity. So that's one place, and the fuel supply for the reactors is not getting the level of attention that the reactors themselves are getting. And there's been, I think, an underinvestment in supply chain because we've sort of slept on the security risk, and we've slept on the risk around the vulnerability of a concentrated supply chain. So innovation's been happening sort of like in the frontier, and that's where VC at least flocks. And PE is sort of lived between platform investments, digital and financial, and then growth for the frontier. The going just back into the guts of the industrial system, on top of which all of this will rest, the sort of low center of gravity for the point guard. That's not where the capital's been going. And I think that's where the smart money will go, especially at this time of political uncertainty and global volatility. Got the new.
Got it. Do you want to ask one more question?
No, I mean, I think if well, let me just ask like one reflective question, and we can wrap. Just as you think back for the last 4 years, what are maybe just, and you touched on this in the speech, but what's one area where you think you got things right, and then one area where you feel like you wish you had done things a little differently?
Let me start with the done things differently. I think we moved sequentially through the transformation that was taking place on the ground. The passage of legislation and then factories showing up 2 years later is super fast. But it's too slow relative to the political cycle. And so, yes, those factories are now hiring. They now have the people on board. And that probably is a great defense to efforts to roll back. But if we figured out a way, and I don't know what it exactly looks like, to help people understand those jobs were coming sooner. If we got, for example, some of the money we asked for in the Inflation Reduction Act to front load the training for those workers, to fund, for example, paid transition, as opposed to having sort of a drop off between old energy job and new energy job. I think we would have kept folks, we would have bought ourselves the political capital to keep going bigger, as opposed to be having a conversation about whether we'll fall back or not. I think the thing we got right, and this goes to the core of my thesis here, is for the first time in a determined and unwavering way, we fashioned a climate program that eschewed the doom and gloom and embraced the hope and possibilities, that took on a global problem and delivered locally. And I think that is the most powerful way forward on a problem that has so many facets, that impacts our public health, impacts our national security, impacts so many things, that you can get distracted in the storytelling of it. I think drawing from the wellspring of economic hope, that's an undepleting resource in a democracy, if you can fill it. And that's where I hope we'll stay. I've spent a lot of time over the last 4 years talking about the domestic part of that equation. I think there's a whole global dimension, and I wanted to shed some light on that today.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Let me also just add my thanks. Justin, Ali, it was really great to be with you. Thank you all for coming at the end of the semester. This topic and many others in climate space, we'll have a lot more discussion about this here, but also our partners in climate and EEII over the next semester. We're going to be working pretty intensively on the climate food nexus, which you guys brought up today. So, please stay tuned for that. But again, let's thank our wonderful speakers.